They say the most dangerous men are impossible to stop. They were wrong. The only person who ever stopped me couldn't even see my face. My name is Vincent Moretti, and for 15 years, this city moved when I decided it should move. Politicians delayed meetings because my convoy was running 5 minutes late. CEOs answered their phones when my name appeared. Even the traffic seemed to know better than to stand in my way. That Tuesday night, the rain fell so hard it blurred the skyline into silver ghosts beyond the tinted windows of my black Escalade. Water drummed against the roof with a steady rhythm while the windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the storm. We had just left a charity banquet downtown, one of those polished events where expensive smiles hid expensive secrets. My driver kept both hands locked on the wheel as we rolled through the empty streets of Manhattan, our headlights cutting across the wet pavement. Four SUVs traveled with us, their engines humming in perfect formation, every movement rehearsed, every turn anticipated. Silence filled the cabin except for the quiet jazz playing through the speakers and the occasional update coming through my security earpiece. I preferred silence. It let me think. It reminded everyone around me that I never needed to raise my voice to be heard. We approached a narrow intersection where construction barriers forced traffic into a single lane. My driver eased off the accelerator. That's when everything changed. A white cane appeared first, tapping carefully across the slick pavement. Then she stepped into the headlights. A young woman wearing a navy raincoat moved slowly, feeling every inch of the street with patient confidence. She never looked toward us because she couldn't. Rain soaked her light brown hair as it escaped from beneath her hood, and beside her walked a golden retriever wearing a bright red service harness. The dog suddenly stopped and let out a low whine. The woman knelt immediately, running gentle fingers over the dog's front paw. She whispered something too soft for me to hear, then stayed exactly where she was, blocking the road without realizing it. My lead security vehicle braked so abruptly that water sprayed across the sidewalk. Doors opened almost instantly. I watched several of my men step into the rain with the familiar urgency of people who believed every delay might be a threat. They weren't angry. They were simply doing what years of training had taught them to do. Remove every obstacle. Protect the boss. Keep moving. One of them started toward her, but before he could speak, I opened my own door. Cold rain struck my face as I stepped onto the pavement. The city seemed to pause. My polished shoes splashed through shallow puddles while every eye settled on me. The woman never reacted. She was still comforting her dog, completely unaware that more than 40 people had frozen in place because of one unexpected moment. For the first time in years, nobody was watching me. They were watching her. And somehow, without fear, without power, without even knowing my name, she had accomplished something no rival, no politician, no millionaire, and no enemy had ever managed to do. She had stopped Vincent Moretti. The rain soaked through my suit within seconds, but I barely noticed. Every pair of eyes followed me instead of the woman kneeling in the middle of the street. My security team spread out by instinct, forming the invisible wall they had built around me for years, waiting for a single signal that would tell them how this night would continue. One gesture from my hand could have cleared the intersection in moments. That was how my world worked. Problems disappeared before they became inconveniences. Yet I found myself standing perfectly still, watching a woman who had no idea who stood less than 10 feet away from her. Her golden retriever lifted one paw, and she gently brushed rainwater from the thick fur before speaking in the calmest voice I had heard in years. "You are all right, Cooper. We are not in a hurry." There was something strangely powerful about those words. Nobody ever said that around me. Everyone in my life lived in a hurry because of me. Every meeting began early. Every room was prepared before I entered. Every conversation raced toward whatever answer they believed I wanted. This woman, however, spoke as if time belonged to her instead of the city. One of my senior guards stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Sir, allow us to escort her safely to the sidewalk." I heard the question hidden beneath his professionalism. He wanted permission to restore order. I looked at him for a long second before speaking a single word. Enough. The rain seemed louder after that. Nobody moved. 40 trained professionals who could coordinate without speaking suddenly became statues beneath the streetlights. The woman tilted her head slightly, finally realizing she was not alone. She smiled politely toward the sound of my voice, although her unfocused eyes rested somewhere beyond my shoulder. "I am sorry," she said. "My dog stepped on broken glass. I think he is scared more than hurt. Could someone tell me if the traffic light is still red?" No fear. No apology for delaying important people. Only concern for the animal sitting faithfully beside her. I answered before anyone else could. "You still have time." She nodded with quiet relief. "Thank you." Most drivers only honk. A laugh almost escaped me. I could not remember the last time anyone had spoken to me without caution, expectation, or calculation. She spoke to me the same way she would speak to a cashier at a grocery store or a neighbor walking past her apartment. To her, I was simply another voice in the rain. She carefully reached into her canvas shoulder bag and removed a small bottle of water along with a clean cloth. Every movement was practiced. Every touch was gentle. Cooper leaned against her knee while she cleaned his paw with remarkable patience. I glanced toward the scattered pieces of broken pavement near the construction barrier and realized the dog had protected her from stepping directly into them. The thought settled somewhere unexpected inside me. Loyalty without conditions. I understood that language better than most people, yet seeing it expressed so quietly felt different. "There," she whispered to the dog. "You were very brave." She slowly stood, resting one hand on the white cane and the other on Cooper's harness. Then she faced my direction once more. "Thank you for waiting," she said with a warm smile that somehow reached people she could never see. Kindness is becoming rare these days. It is nice to know there is still some left. Before I could answer, the traffic signal chimed softly, and she crossed the street with steady confidence, disappearing into the curtain of rain. None of my men spoke. Neither did I, because for reasons I could not explain, the city suddenly felt quieter after she walked away. I did not tell my driver where we were going after that. Instead, I stared through the rain-covered window as the city drifted past, my reflection barely visible against the blurred lights of Manhattan. Nobody inside the convoy dared interrupt my silence. They had all witnessed the same impossible scene. A woman who had unknowingly delayed my entire operation thanked me for waiting and walked away believing I was simply another stranger willing to be patient. Long after we reached my townhouse overlooking the East River, I found myself standing beside the floor-to-ceiling windows instead of going upstairs. The city glittered beneath the clouds, restless as always, but my thoughts remained fixed on a quiet voice asking whether the traffic light was still red. I had spent years remembering license plates, business deals, and faces that could become threats. Yet somehow I could not stop remembering the smile of someone who had never even seen mine. Just after midnight, I pressed a single button on my desk. My head of security entered less than 30 seconds later. Daniel Brooks had worked beside me for almost a decade. He understood the difference between curiosity and an order. Tonight, he recognized both. "The woman from the intersection," I said. "Find her." He gave one respectful nod. "Yes, sir." He did not ask why. By sunrise, a slim folder rested beside my morning espresso. I opened it slowly. Grace Sullivan, 26 years old, born in Albany, New York. Lost her eyesight at the age of 6 after a severe illness. No criminal record. No lawsuits. No wealthy relatives. She rented a small apartment in Queens, taught piano 3 afternoons each week at a nonprofit center for visually impaired children, and volunteered every Saturday morning at an animal rescue. She had owned Cooper for 4 years after adopting him from the same shelter, where she still donated part of every paycheck. I turned another page. Medical expenses. Student loans. Rent receipts always paid on time. Several anonymous donations had been offered over the years to assist her. Every one of them had been declined. Attached to the final page was a photograph taken outside the community music center only 3 days earlier. Grace stood beside Cooper with one hand resting gently on his back, while 3 children laughed around an old upright piano someone had clearly restored instead of replacing. She was smiling exactly the same way she had smiled in the rain. Not because anyone was watching, simply because she was happy. I leaned back in my chair and studied the photograph longer than I intended. Daniel remained standing across the room. "There is something else," he said carefully. "Several businesses have tried to purchase the building where the music center operates. The owner refused every offer." "Why?" I asked. "According to public records, the property is worth considerably more than the neighborhood average." Daniel placed another document on the desk. Developers want the entire block for a luxury project. I nodded absent-mindedly, but my attention returned to the photograph. Grace had no idea powerful people wanted the place where she spent most of her week. She probably believed the biggest challenge in her life was keeping old pianos in tune and making certain Cooper never stepped on broken glass again. I closed the folder and looked toward the skyline as morning sunlight slowly replaced the storm. I had built my life believing that every person had a price, every decision had a motive, and every kindness expected something in return. Yet everything I had learned about Grace Sullivan contradicted those rules. For the first time in many years, I was not investigating an enemy. I was trying to understand someone who expected absolutely nothing from the world except the chance to make it a little gentler for everyone else. 3 days passed before I allowed myself to see her again. Not as Vincent Moretti. Not as the man whose name opened locked doors. Just another face hidden beneath a charcoal coat and a baseball cap pulled low enough to disappear into the morning crowd. Queens smelled different from downtown Manhattan. Fresh coffee drifted from family-owned bakeries. School buses stopped every few blocks. Children laughed without checking who might be listening. It felt strangely ordinary, almost unfamiliar. I stood across the street from the community music center just before 9 o'clock. The building was old enough to remember better decades. Red brick faded by years of harsh winters. White paint peeling from the window frames. A small wooden sign hung above the entrance, swaying gently in the cool breeze. Grace arrived exactly on time with Cooper leading confidently along the sidewalk. She greeted nearly everyone by name. The elderly crossing guard. The teenagers sweeping outside the corner grocery store. The woman delivering flowers to the church across the street. They all smiled when they heard her voice. Nobody pitied her. They simply welcomed her. Inside the music center, I remained near an open hallway where the sound of an old, upright piano floated through the building. The instrument had not been tuned properly in years, yet Grace somehow made every note feel intentional. Children's voices followed, uncertain at first, then growing stronger as she encouraged them one by one. "Do not worry about perfection," she said with an easy laugh. "Music does not ask you to be perfect. It only asks you to be honest." I had negotiated million-dollar agreements with less confidence than those children showed after hearing her speak. One little boy stumbled through the melody 3 times before finally reaching the last measure. The room erupted into applause. Grace clapped the loudest. "I knew you could do it," she told him. "Sometimes courage sounds better than talent." I looked around the room. Worn chairs, faded sheet music, a ceiling that clearly needed repairs. Yet every child sitting there looked richer than many people I had met in penthouses overlooking Central Park. They possessed something money could never purchase. They believed in themselves because she believed in them first. Later that afternoon, after the last lesson ended, I watched Grace carry a small cardboard box toward the front office. The director, an elderly woman with silver hair, sighed before speaking. "Grace, you really should keep more of your paycheck." Grace smiled as if she had heard the argument 100 times before. "I have everything I need. You barely have enough for yourself. Then I have exactly enough to understand what these children need." The older woman accepted the envelope with reluctant gratitude. Once Grace left the office, curiosity pulled me inside. The director looked at me with polite confusion until I introduced myself under a different name and asked whether the center accepted donations. Her face brightened immediately. She explained that the building needed repairs, new instruments, and updated accessibility equipment, but funding had become harder every year. I quietly wrote a check large enough to replace every piano in the building. She stared at the number for several long seconds before shaking her head. "This is incredibly generous," she whispered. "May I tell Miss Sullivan who made this possible?" I thought about Grace thanking a stranger in the rain simply for waiting. I remembered her saying kindness was becoming rare. Then I folded the check back into my pocket. "No," I answered softly. "If she asks, tell her someone believes her work matters." The director smiled warmly. "She will probably thank God instead." As I walked back toward the street, I found myself smiling for the first time in longer than I could remember. It lasted only a moment, long enough for me to realize something uncomfortable. I had intended to help her with money. Instead, she had already begun changing something far more valuable inside me. The following Monday began with a phone call that should have been routine. Daniel entered my office carrying a leather folder instead of his usual tablet, a habit he reserved for matters that required complete attention. He placed the folder on my desk without speaking. I opened it and immediately recognized the address before reading a single word. The Community Music Center. Several commercial developers had quietly formed a partnership to purchase every building on the block. Their proposal promised luxury apartments, upscale restaurants, and a private fitness club overlooking the river. On paper, it looked like progress. In reality, it erased the only affordable center serving hundreds of visually impaired children and adults across 3 boroughs. Who was leading the project? I asked. Daniel answered without hesitation. Ethan Caldwell. I leaned back slowly. Ethan and I had crossed paths for years. Unlike me, he preferred expensive headlines and public praise. He built his reputation by calling himself a visionary investor. The city admired his polished speeches. Very few people noticed how many neighborhoods disappeared after his investments arrived. Daniel slid another document toward me. The board plans to vote in 10 days. 10 days. I closed the folder and looked toward the window, but my thoughts were already somewhere else. That afternoon, I parked several blocks away from the music center and walked the remaining distance alone. A crowd had gathered outside the entrance. Parents stood beside teachers. Volunteers handed out flyers while local reporters adjusted cameras near the sidewalk. Curious pedestrians slowed to ask questions. I stayed near the back where nobody recognized me. Then I heard her voice carried gently through a portable speaker. Grace stood at the front of the gathering with Cooper lying quietly beside her feet. She held no prepared speech, no dramatic signs, just a folded sheet of paper she never once looked at because she did not need to. This building is more than bricks, she began calmly. Some children walk through these doors believing they would never play music. Some adults arrived believing losing their eyesight meant losing their future. They found hope here. You cannot calculate hope on a financial spreadsheet. The crowd became completely silent. Even the passing traffic seemed farther away. People often tell us progress requires sacrifice, she continued. I agree. But the people making sacrifices should also have a voice. If you replace every place where compassion lives with another luxury building, eventually you will have a beautiful city where nobody feels welcome. Applause spread slowly before growing louder. Parents wiped tears from their eyes. One little girl reached for Grace's hand and smiled with complete trust. I watched reporters lower their cameras for a moment simply to listen. She had no political influence, no wealth, no famous last name. Yet somehow she commanded attention through nothing except honesty. That was a kind of authority I had never learned. As the crowd dispersed, Daniel quietly approached from behind. Our analysts estimate Caldwell has already convinced 4 members of the property board, he said. If nothing changes, the center will lose. I kept watching Grace as she thanked every volunteer individually, refusing to leave until the last folding chair had been carried inside. She had no idea how close she was to losing the place she loved most. She believed kindness and reason would be enough. I wish they were. Because as I stood there beneath the fading afternoon sun, I realized something I had not expected. This was no longer about an old building in Queens. Somewhere along the way, without permission and without trying, Grace Sullivan had given me a reason to care about something beyond my own world. And I was no longer willing to stand quietly while someone tried to take it away. That evening I called no meetings. I signed no contracts. Every report waiting on my desk remained untouched while I studied the city lights beyond my office windows. Somewhere across the river, Grace was probably finishing another lesson, walking Cooper through familiar streets, believing tomorrow would look exactly like today. She still believed fairness had a chance. I envied that. Daniel entered carrying fresh intelligence before sunset. Caldwell has begun visiting board members personally, he said. He is offering generous redevelopment incentives. I nodded once. Has anyone accepted? Several appear interested. I closed the folder without reading another page. Then schedule breakfast with the remaining members. Daniel understood immediately. Understood. By the following morning, conversations that had been impossible a week earlier suddenly became surprisingly productive. A retired architect agreed to review the center's historical value. A local philanthropist offered emergency preservation funding. A respected accessibility foundation announced interest in partnering with the music center. None of those people ever learned my name had quietly connected every phone call. That was exactly how I wanted it. Grace deserved allies, not debts. 2 afternoons later, I parked across from the center again. The front steps buzzed with cautious optimism. Volunteers carried donated music stands through the entrance, while a delivery truck unloaded 3 beautifully restored upright pianos. The director looked overwhelmed. Anonymous donor, one worker explained with a grin. Can you believe it? Grace laughed softly as she ran her fingertips across the polished wood of one piano. Someone out there must really love music. I remained inside my car, hidden behind tinted glass, listening through the slightly open window. She never suspected the instruments had passed through my warehouse only 24 hours earlier. Watching her smile felt strangely satisfying. It was the first business decision in years that produced no financial return, yet somehow it felt like the most profitable investment I had ever made. Life, however, rarely allows peace to last. Later that afternoon, Daniel's phone rang while we reviewed unrelated matters. His expression changed almost immediately. Sir, he said quietly after ending the call. Someone approached Miss Sullivan outside the grocery store this morning. My attention sharpened. What happened? Nothing serious. A representative connected to Caldwell's development company attempted to persuade her to stop speaking publicly. According to witnesses, the conversation remained polite, but persistent. I stood and walked toward the window again. Grace had probably responded with calm honesty, believing respectful conversation could solve everything. She had no reason to think otherwise. Daniel continued. She declined every offer. Financial assistance, employment opportunities, relocation support. She refused all of it. Of course she did. Money had never been the language she understood best. Respect was. Conviction was. Hope was. That evening I drove past the music center one final time before returning home. The lights inside still glowed long after sunset. Through the front windows, I could see Grace sitting alone at one of the new pianos. Her fingers floated gently across the keys while Cooper rested beside the bench with his head on his paws. No audience. No applause. Just music drifting into the quiet street. I stayed there longer than I intended, listening to notes I could not name, but somehow understood. For years, people had mistaken silence for emptiness. Grace had taught me something different. Silence could also be where courage learned to breathe. As I finally pulled away from the curb, I noticed a black luxury sedan parked half a block behind mine. It had not been there when I arrived. The driver remained inside, watching the music center instead of the traffic. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it was coincidence. Yet after everything I had learned, instinct whispered a warning I had trusted my entire adult life. Grace still believed the world was filled mostly with good people. I hoped she was right. But until I knew for certain, someone would always be watching over the woman who had unknowingly changed the direction of my life. The board meeting was scheduled for Friday morning, and by then the entire neighborhood seemed to be holding its breath. Volunteers arrived before sunrise to hang handmade banners outside the music center. Parents brought coffee and pastries. Children rehearsed songs they hoped would remind the board what this place truly meant. I watched from inside a black sedan parked across the street, unwilling to become part of the story she believed belonged to ordinary people. Daniel sat beside me reviewing updates as they arrived. 4 board members now favored preserving the building. 3 still supported Caldwell's proposal. 1 vote remained uncertain. The deciding member just entered the conference room, Daniel said quietly. I nodded, but kept my attention on Grace. She stood near the entrance greeting every family by name, offering encouragement even though she carried the greatest burden herself. She smiled as if she genuinely believed hope was contagious. Maybe it was. Just before the hearing began, a reporter approached her with a microphone. Miss Sullivan, many people say anonymous financial supporters have suddenly appeared to help your center. Do you know who they are? Grace laughed softly. No, but I hope they know they have already changed more lives than they realize. The words landed harder than she could possibly know. An hour later, the first updates reached Daniel's phone. The discussion inside had become unexpectedly tense. Caldwell's legal team argued redevelopment would generate jobs and tax revenue. Parents spoke about accessibility. Teachers described children discovering confidence through music. Grace never raised her voice. She simply told the board that every community deserved one place where people were valued for who they were instead of what they could afford. Then everything changed. Another reporter rushed toward the crowd, holding a tablet. Breaking news, he announced loudly. Records reveal anonymous donations connected to the music center were routed through charitable foundations tied to Vincent Moretti. Conversations stopped instantly. Cameras turned. Whispers spread through the crowd like wind across dry leaves. I closed my eyes for a brief second. Someone had traced the financial trail despite every precaution. Daniel looked at me. "I am sorry, sir." Across the street, Grace stood perfectly still. One reporter approached carefully. "Miss Sullivan, were you aware one of New York's most influential businessmen has been supporting your organization?" Another asked a different question before she could answer. "Did you know about his reputation?" Grace slowly lowered her head. She did not speak for several seconds. Then she asked the only question that mattered. "The gentleman who waited while Cooper hurt his paw, was that Vincent Moretti?" Nobody answered immediately. They did not need to. Silence became the answer. I stepped out of the car before Daniel could stop me. Reporters noticed almost instantly. Cameras followed as I crossed the street toward the entrance. The crowd parted without a word. Grace heard the footsteps and turned in my direction. Although her eyes could not meet mine, I had never felt more completely seen. "It was you," she said quietly. I stopped a few feet away. "Yes." Her fingers tightened around Cooper's harness. "The donations. The pianos. Everything." "Yes." She took a slow breath, and when she spoke again, there was no anger in her voice. Only disappointment, so deep it weighed more than any accusation. "Why did you never tell me?" I searched for an answer that would explain years of instinct, caution, and distance. None felt worthy of her honesty. Finally, I said the only truth I had. Because I wanted one place in this city where people smiled before they knew my name. Grace remained silent for a long moment. Then she whispered words I will remember for the rest of my life. "I never needed your money, Vincent. I only needed to believe that the kind man I met in the rain was real." For the first time in many years, I did not know whether I deserved the answer she was waiting to hear. Grace walked away before I found the courage to say anything else. Cooper stayed close to her side, guiding her carefully through the crowd while reporters shouted questions she refused to answer. She simply thanked the families for standing together, wished the children luck with their music lessons, and disappeared down the sidewalk without looking back. I remained standing outside the meeting hall long after everyone else had left. Daniel approached quietly. "The board postponed the vote until Monday," he said. "They want time to review additional preservation documents." I nodded without responding. The future of the building suddenly felt less important than the fact that I had watched disappointment replace trust in the only person whose opinion had ever mattered to me. 2 days passed without seeing her. I respected the distance she had chosen, even though every instinct urged me to explain myself. On Sunday afternoon, Daniel entered my office carrying fresh updates. "Grace never attended yesterday's volunteer session," he reported. "Several neighbors say she has stayed inside her apartment." That was unlike her. Before I could answer, another call interrupted him. He listened for less than a minute before looking directly at me. "Sir, Cooper was found alone outside the music center this morning." My heart tightened immediately. "Where is Grace?" "Nobody knows." Within minutes, every available contact I trusted was quietly searching hospitals, transit stations, shelters, and community centers. There were no dramatic sirens, no frantic headlines, just dozens of ordinary conversations happening across the city as people asked gentle questions and shared recent sightings. Grace had simply disappeared. Hours later, an answer finally arrived. Daniel handed me a small envelope delivered anonymously to one of our offices. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "If the music center survives tomorrow, several investors will lose millions. Convince Grace Sullivan to withdraw her public campaign before the vote." No signature. No threat written directly. None was necessary. The meaning was painfully clear. I looked up at Daniel. Where did this come from? A courier left it without speaking. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my pocket. "Find her." He nodded once and left the room without another word. Night settled over Manhattan before my phone finally rang again. This time the voice belonged to an elderly woman who managed a small church pantry in Queens. "Mr. Moretti," she said gently, "I believe." Monday morning arrived beneath a clear blue sky that made the city seem lighter than it had in weeks. I stood outside the community music center before the board meeting began, not surrounded by a convoy or hidden behind dark windows, but alone. For the first time in years, I wanted nothing from the people walking past me except the chance to tell the truth. Families gathered once again along the sidewalk. Children carried sheet music instead of protest signs. Volunteers welcomed everyone with coffee and quiet smiles. Hope returned carefully, like sunlight after a long storm. Grace arrived a few minutes later with Cooper walking proudly beside her. She stopped when she recognized my footsteps. Before I could speak, she smiled gently. "You came. I promised you that you would not stand alone." She nodded thoughtfully. "Then stand with everyone else." Those simple words changed everything. We entered the meeting separately. She spoke for the community. I spoke only when invited. When my turn came, I looked directly at every board member before saying something I never imagined I would admit in public. Cities are measured by more than new buildings. They are measured by whether people still have places where kindness is allowed to grow. The room became completely silent. I continued without looking at a single reporter. This center gave hope to children long before I ever noticed it. If preserving it costs more than replacing it, then perhaps we have forgotten what value truly means. When the final vote was announced, the Music Center had been granted permanent historical and community protection. Applause filled the room. Parents embraced one another. Children laughed without worrying about tomorrow. Grace quietly thanked every board member before stepping outside into the warm afternoon. Reporters surrounded her, asking how she felt. She answered with the same grace that had first stopped me on a rainy night. Today was never about winning. It was about reminding people that compassion deserves an address too. She politely excused herself and walked toward the small garden beside the building where spring flowers had just begun to bloom. I followed a few moments later. Cooper wagged his tail the instant he sensed me approaching. Grace reached one hand toward the sound of my footsteps. I hesitated only briefly before taking it. Her fingers rested lightly against my face, tracing the line of my jaw with remarkable gentleness. She smiled in the quiet way only she could. "I still do not know what you look like," she whispered, "but I know your heart now." I closed my eyes because no one had ever seen me so clearly. Not business partners. Not rivals. Not friends. Certainly not myself. She lowered her hand and laughed softly. The man I met in the rain was real after all. I smiled for the first time without wondering who might be watching. Months later, the Music Center echoed with new pianos, children's songs, and the familiar sound of Cooper wandering happily through the hallways. I visited often, never as the most powerful man in the room, only as someone learning to listen. People sometimes ask me what changed my life. They expect a dramatic answer, some extraordinary moment worthy of legend. The truth is much simpler. One rainy night, a woman who could not see my face reminded me that the strongest people are not the ones who make the world step aside. They are the ones who make the world stop long enough to remember what truly matters. And every time I hear children laughing inside that old brick building, I remember that power built my reputation, but kindness gave me back my name.